It's my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Park today. Jonathan worked in measurement in his master's at California. Sorry. Jonathan worked in measurement in his master's at California State University at Fullerton. And during his PhD at Penn State, he actively worked on network models involving both discrete and continuous time. Finally, huge congratulations on that he will be starting his new career in this fall as an assistant professor of shy. Jonathan has always been more than just a colleague. He's been a friendly and supportive member of our graduate student committee and a humorous labmate who I really enjoy speaking with on both daily life and research. And he's one of the people I observed who get really excited when talking about their own research. I don't believe he will stop working hard in his life. But if I may add, please remember to take care of yourself too. So today's talk is about unsupervised model construction in continuous time. While this may be his last QuantDev talk as a graduate student, I believe it will not be the last time we hear from him. So will you come again when we invite you, right? Please give me a warm welcome to Jonathan.
I'm not going to live up to that. I do think it's bittersweet because like my first QuantDev talk was in person, and I'm glad that like the apocalypse has settled enough that we're in person again. I was trying to get your attention earlier, Zach. You actually are sitting exactly how Peter used to sit during the QuantDev meetings. He would sit in that exact seat, and then he would like twiddle his thumbs, like on his stomach, and then he would fall asleep, but then still pay attention. So to the other point about like, this is really weird. To the other point about like coming back, at least in my experience as a student, I don't recall very many alumni coming back. I think the last alumni I recall in immediate memory is Siwei, and that was her job talk. So then like when I think about like alumni that you guys could invite back, I don't know why you would pick me. There's quite a list of people that I would also pick above myself. So, but yes, definitely, if I do something that is relevant to the student like me, I would love to come back. So my talk is on unsupervised model construction in continuous time, which is just a fancy way of I'll get there eventually, but you can see on the slides that eventually I'll get to just saying continuous time gimme. Imagine if I just didn't consent to the screen recording. And I'm just like, no, talk is done. So we're gonna get there. It's gonna be about continuous time gimme. But just to sound cool, we're gonna call it unsupervised model construction in continuous time. Where is this? All right, yeah. So Youngwon spilled the beans. Oh damn! How'd that happen? How'd that slip in there? Oopsies. I've been like changing up my slides. I've shared this template with several of you as grad students, and I was like, I need to finally like change it up so that people aren't just always using the same thing. So if I share this with you, there's like new buttons and stuff that are coded in. So you can just ask for it and I'll share like the template, but it adds like appendices that you can just click to and it'll reroute and stuff. So if anyone's interested, you can just ask me and I'll send you the code. A lot of it's commented out because I don't need it for this, but it is coded in. So back to the regular Penn State theme. Talk, right? So I like to always try to convince people that the thing that I'm doing is interesting. So the angle that I'm taking today is on heterogeneity. We'll get there. And then I'm going to talk about gimme and how it's good for modeling heterogeneity. Then I'm going to talk about continuous time gimme because it adds something that regular gimme doesn't have. And you can take a guess as to what that is. And then I'll talk about simulations that we've been doing for the past like 4 weeks nonstop that are still running right now. And then I have closing statements, just broad things about what I think was fucking awesome about the results that we have so far. So longstanding issue in quantitative methods and really just like research in general, right? Like even broader statistics and just broader research of understanding how the world works. revolves around within sample heterogeneity. We get a sample of things, and then we're trying to fight the like everything to be an identical clone, but there's some wiggle in the things that we're grouping. I've given a previous talk on fuzziness, how we make groups, but those groups aren't exactly groups. They're more like amalgams of things that have similar features, but there's a lot of things that aren't similar, but we're willing to call them groups because it's convenient. And I think like a lot of the work that we do ultimately comes down to how do we accommodate that? How do we deal with the fact that the group that we deal with, the group that we model, isn't exactly homogeneous? And there's a whole host of methods, right? All of us are doing that in some way, shape, or form. There's methods that people have made that are much better than mine, that range from completely ignoring within sample heterogeneity, right? There's people who will just fit a group level model and say, you all share this one dynamic process, this one set of point estimates. I'm not going to deal with the heterogeneity part. And then on the flip side, you have, let's just fit n equals 1 models. And surely there's some overlap between some features of our dynamics, but they're like, no, there's no overlap. I don't believe any of these people actually exist, but like, if you had to take extreme ends of this argument, those would be those. And like I'm saying here, both of those ends have some limitations, right? So I was thinking about this at like 2 a.m, about like how I can talk about this, like what is this idea of heterogeneity that I want to like spew out and convince you guys about. So I've mentioned before about idio-thetic methods. This is a term in like personality psychology. I think Allport first mentioned it in like 1937. And then there's more recent papers that I've seen talking about it recently, like 2023. So idio-thetic methods really just like are a spectrum of these methods where we kind of have varying allowance for that degree of heterogeneity. How much do we allow the individual to express themselves? How much do we say, no, they're all a group, right? So on one extreme end, you have just nomothetic models. If you want to imagine each circle is a person, then we have 3 people, but we're just saying they're all the same. They're one group. They form this cohesive group together. And then on the opposite end, we have a bunch of circles, and we're just saying they're all separate circles, and we're not acknowledging the fact that there's overlap between them. And then hopefully somewhere we have models that accommodate the degree of overlap, but also acknowledge that uniqueness, right? And so a lot of the methods that we deal with are mostly in that central space, right? When we think about multi-level models, when we think about cluster-based models that I work with, when we think about like dynamic mixture models, multi-var, all these things are about how much do we allow for the group to exist and how much do we allow for the individual to like express themselves beyond that. And related to that, all of these methods I think are really useful. And once we can kind of derive a set of rules or a set of models that kind of span that whole spectrum of how constrained or how loose we are with what defines a group, then it's up to our theorist friends to come up with unique ideas based off of those models, right? Our ideal is that we'll come up with and allow for more flexibility in how we're fitting these models. Then it's up to your creativity as to how we can implement them. So I have this quote. It's, at what point does a quote just get too long? But I don't know. This is from Lamiel in 1981. They said that the research of the type just described would be idiographic in the sense that it would involve the study of single individuals over time. It would also be nomothetic, however, in that it would seek to confirm across individuals the applicability of certain basic principles to an understanding of theoretically relevant phenomenon. So really, let's study a bunch of people. Let's find the things that are common to them, but also acknowledge the uniquenesses. In a word, the research would be idio-thetic. So I want to couch all of these conversations today, this algorithm, whatever, as an idio-thetic method, right? So we're using person-specific information to derive some sort of group structure, some group inference, and hopefully that'll feed back and benefit us in some way. So let's start with GIME. I've mentioned GIME a couple times. So the long-winded version of GIME is the group iterative multiple model estimation. I'd like to say procedure at the end. I don't know. Is there like a nomenclature that's like more accepted? I say procedure. Framework. Should I set up a doodle poll? But it's one of those. It's a way of estimating a certain type of model. and it has an algorithm tied to it, and there's cool things about it. So I would call Gimme an idio-thetic method. It identifies group level commonalities and dynamic patterns, how people change over time using person specific information in the structural VAR framework, right? So that's a type of model, and then Gimme isn't necessarily a type of model, but a way of fitting that type of model. And it uses group level structures that it derives from that person level information, and it feeds it back, right? So various simulation studies have found that the common group structure that's found in Gimme also helps inform and kind of process out or filter out the noise, and it helps identify person level paths as well. So there's kind of like feedback where the person level information helps us find group level structure, and then that group level structure hopefully helps us separate out some noise and find more common or unique individual features. And it does all this in a data-driven way. It identifies these dynamic patterns using unsupervised model search via modification indices, right? So it constructs some sort of null model. It assesses modification indices, and it'll add parameters that meet certain criterion. And I'll talk about kind of the more detailed parts later. Now, while I was on the job market, I got really interested in like history of things, because I was talking to people who were significantly older than me, and I thought history would be the thing that we have common ground on. But also, I think it's just really interesting to think about what the problems are that we're trying to solve when we come up with these ideas. And thanks to Zach, actually, I gave a talk at UCLA, I think last year, and the slides that he gave me had a couple bits about the history of Gimme, about like the first 3 big articles that came out kind of setting up what the algorithm would be. And all of them were about modeling heterogeneous time series. And when we think about how the Gimme algorithm uses the structural VAR and the characteristic of fMRI data, a lot of these decisions and things make a lot of sense. So in the case of like heterogeneous time series of fMRI data, there's a large mismatch between the underlying process that we hope to measure, right, neurological data, versus the rate at which we actually sample that data, right? We sample it incredibly slowly, maybe once a second, 2 times, or once every second, or once every 2 seconds. There we go. So there's a big mismatch between the process and the actual time. And when I talk about the structural VAR in a couple of slides, I'll talk about the contemporaneous effects and how like the model is appropriate for that kind of problem. In fact, I'm just stupid and I could just read my slides. So it leverages contemporaneous effects to model those faster dynamics. So like in the context of the development of this algorithm, a lot of the decisions and questions make sense as to how they were thinking about how to construct this algorithm. And I'm using this slide again because now I can officially say I've used this figure in every QuantDev talk I've ever given since my first year. So there you go. So this is the standard VAR. It is a lag1 VAR, 2 variables, so a 2-variate VAR1. And you can see that it's just basically the variables relating to themselves at the next time step and each other, right? So I think given the audience, I don't need to explain this very much, so just there you go. And apropos to what I said a couple slides ago, the structural VAR is appropriate for modeling these kinds of faster timescales because just the lagged effects aren't enough when your measurement interval is orders of magnitude slower than the actual process is happening. And in a way, the structural VAR, by modeling the residuals, right, to get those contemporaneous effects out, is kind of a second pass at getting that information out, right? And so we see from that A matrix, it's a modeling of the effects that are happening. I think in some texts, they'll use the word instantaneous effects. So these are just the effects that are happening within whatever the lag is, right? And this is all conditional on the fact that you've actually partialed out all the other higher order lags. But assuming you've done that, then the contemporaneous effects are in the residuals and you can model this out. I don't need to cover that. And so just some comments and considerations closing out, because I don't want to spend too much time on just Gimme. So Gimme has seen widespread usage, not just on fMRI data from which it was developed with consideration for, but also on affect, broader EMA data, daily diary studies, et cetera, and consistently across simulation studies from separate authors, separate people, using different data generating mechanisms. Gimme has consistently done well in recovering those kinds of group level dynamics from person level information, right? So even if we have heterogeneous samples of people, if they do share common paths, Gimme generally does a good job at recovering those common paths. And then I have this caveat just to kind of spur on the next point, is that despite all of its success, Gimme is still developed in the discrete time framework and has some of the limitations kind of associated with discrete time models that I'll be talking about in the next slide. What a great segue, go me. And so this section is just called the problem with time. And I was like, that's really big. Like, that's like a really meaty headline, and I'm not going to be able to match up with that, but I didn't want to change it. And so there are several issues relating to modeling with respect to time, and I'm talking specifically about issues that can come up with modeling with modeling processes in a discrete time framework, but they're not necessarily just problems with discrete time models. Like if you're wrong enough, it'll still affect continuous time models too. So one such problem is that results can vary across timescales, particularly with discrete time series. I'm going to have an example about taking medication and measuring it at different intervals. Also, likewise, in the real world, we don't often gather our data in neat equidistant intervals, right? So like when you're taking a survey, I know like I think Apple they have like a new app that actually lets you journal your mood now. So you can like set scheduled reminders about how you're feeling, and I have never hit that on time in my entire life. And so the way that we gather data, when we ping our participants, they're not going to respond exactly at the same time. And a lot of these discrete time methods assume that we have approximately equally spaced intervals in our data. And so not meeting that can lead to bias in our estimates. And likewise, the actual sampling of our process isn't always matched up, right? So sometimes actually a lot of the time in the empirical literature, we're measuring things too slowly relative to how they're unfolding. If we think about emotions, if someone punched me in the face, it probably doesn't take however long it takes for the next measurement occasion for me to get upset. But we're going to capture the effect in that lagged effect or the contemporaneous effect if we're modeling it that way. But likely when someone punches me in the face, it probably upsets me almost instantaneously, but it's not convenient to gather or practical to gather data at such a resolution. So there's a mismatch in the actual like resolution of our sampling as well. So let's just go over some examples, right? So this is a dosage response curve. I used to have an image that I took off the internet, but it was so low resolution, and I kept using it that like artifacts started to build up on the image. So I just simulated this, but just believe me that this is what the curve usually looks like. So this is a dosage response curve. So you can imagine you have a headache, right? And then you take an Advil. And if I happened to assess the severity of your headache 2 minutes after you've taken this medication, and you're like, my head still hurts, it'd be silly if I was like, this medication sucks, it's not good, right? The medication takes time to become bioavailable for you to actually feel the effects of the medication. So there's a lag in the actual effect of the drug. Likewise, if I waited 2 hours on this particular curve and I asked you, how's your headache? And you're like, it still hurts, or it came back all of a sudden, then it would again be weird if we're just like, this medication's horrible. So there's like an optimal time, right? You can ask anyone about optimal timescales, but there's a time where the effect is strongest. And so if we kind of match up our sampling interval with the peak of this distribution, assuming people are just repeatedly popping this pill, you could kind of find this maximal effect. But if you sampled at a different interval consistently, you might find there's a consistent lack of effect. But the thing that's important to clarify is that it's not that when you're sampling at a different time that you're sampling a different relationship necessarily. You're sampling the same thing. It's the relationship between the dosage that you've taken and the severity of your headache. It's just that you're measuring it at a different time in the process. So in a way, this can represent a continuous association between like the medication and your headache. Likewise, to the other 2 points that I had mentioned, we can have this underlying process, but at the rate that we truly sample it, we can have those red dots and the realization of the time series that we actually model versus the true process that lies underneath it. There can be a mismatch, and there's an accumulation of errors if we're sampling too slow. And likewise, if the red dots were unequally spaced, we're going to get some random accumulation of errors at different intervals of time. So there's this kind of accumulation of error that just happens consistently as we're kind of messing with our sampling interval, as well as measuring too slow relative to a process, or even too fast. So there's a host of issues that can come with kind of not accounting for this stuff. So outstanding problems. I put parentheses because I was like, how many problems can I come up with? I remember talking to someone and they're like, you need to have a list of 3 always so that you can end it with etc. And that's when you're like free to go. You've like covered all the things. So in this case, discrete time methods can be affected by common problems associated with real world data collection, right? So unequally spaced data can happen. We often run into issues with different sampling rates across studies. So then trying to compare the, let's say, the dynamic coefficients between studies can be difficult to do. Measuring processes too fast or too slow. And continuous time methods are a good alternative. They're favorable. They aren't as affected by these issues as discrete time methods are. However, there are some limitations, right? Obviously, people aren't just fitting continuous time models all the time. So has to be a reason why people aren't doing it. In my case, I can finally say this like confidently, is that fitting a high dimensional dynamic networks in continuous time can be difficult. Ask me how I know. It's been fucking up every single day. In fact, one of my simulation conditions, I'll talk about exactly the exact condition that has been ruining my life. As well as this idio-thetic methods like Gimme. Given, I've said all these good things. Gimme's great and it has worked incredibly well. But these kinds of idio-thetic methods aren't being developed yet very much in the continuous time literature. You can fit multi-level models in continuous time. You can fit a dynamic mixture in continuous time, right? In theory, you can fit a mixture in continuous time. Yes, Tim.
Sorry, this is a little off topic, but how do continuous time methods help with measuring too fast or too slow relative to the rate of the process? I mean, you don't specifically claim that they do.
So this is from my sleep fatigue that I didn't comment on this, is that you will still run into the issue because we also just we straight up don't know what the true process is.
Even if we do though, I mean, sampling too fast, maybe you can deal with, but you deal with that in a discrete time pretty easily too. If you're sampling too slow relative to the process, how does a continuous time model help you with that? I mean, unless you really have like a mathematical model of the process precisely already, which you don't.
Yes.
From what I've seen, there's a much wider range over which a continuous time model is robust to variation in being too slow than for a discrete time model. Like in a continuous time model, you can have a process that's going on, say, changing daily, but you're measuring every 3 days or something. And you still get most of the variability. You still can get the same parameter estimate over that range. You can still recover the same continuous time parameter estimates, even though you're not measuring at the exact correct rate. There is a boundary at which you're just missing everything. Like, if something is varying minute by minute and you're measuring once per year, you're just totally off base. Like but it's like you have to be off by like orders of magnitude to get bad estimates in continuous time. Whereas if you're off even a little, and every time you change the interval in discrete time, you always get a different estimate.
I'm sure if you change the interval, you get a different estimate, but it's not necessarily an incorrect estimate if you're for that time scale, right? So it's just that the estimate is more stable, which is really a different sampling rates problem rather than the measuring too slow problem.
As far as I know, it's an open question that people haven't addressed in a very thorough way.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, and sorry again for that.
No, thank you. That's actually, hold on. Taking notes. I think it's interesting because it would be a great thing to set up as like a small run. Because I think related to sampling too slow with the discrete time thing, if we're talking about that, is if we just straight up don't know what the underlying process is, and let's go off the premise that the continuous time model will be, a little more robust. It'll be in the neighborhood of being correct a little more often, but it'll give us a consistent estimate of the underlying drift matrix as opposed to, let's say, if we're fitting a VAR model at different timescales. I think the issue with fitting the VAR model, let's say, at different timescales is that you don't know which one is, because like if you're accumulating this random error on each of your VAR models, then you also you don't know what the degree of error is in any direction. Like how if you're modeling at different intervals here, you're getting different effects, right? Like different strengths of the association, but you have that kind of you don't know where in that curve you are. Whereas with modeling too slow or too fast in the continuous time model, you're getting the same roughly set of coefficients describing the underlying process.
Let's take this offline. I think in this figure you're conflating the timing of measurement with the time scale of measurement, which is potentially a problem with this, right? You can miss the peak because you're measuring too soon and too late, and you have to guess at what the curve looks like. But if you're not synchronizing to dose, that's a different problem, right? You're either measuring too fast or too slow as opposed to at the wrong times. So, but let's take that offline and talk about it some other time.
I would still love to add it as a condition.
I think that would be great. I would love to see some data on this because I haven't, and I've seen this claim a lot, and I haven't seen any backing for it. So it'd be great if somebody could get some data on it.
I have covered everything, right? Yes. All right, yeah, so I used this tweet before in one of my QuantDev talks, and I wanted to edit it. So this is just Sasha talking about how he wasn't comfortable with gimme estimating contemporaneous paths that were directed. So I edited it to be about me. And so it's me, and it says, I mainly dislike modeling processes in discrete time. Gimme in continuous time would be cool. And it was posted literally right now. And it has 18 billion likes. And so since so many people are reacting so positively to it, it's crazy. So we finally gotten to the point of the talk. It's unsupervised model construction in continuous time. As I alluded to earlier, it's continuous time gimme. Based off of just the list of people, you know that several people in this room and not in this room have been very intricately involved. And so I'm incredibly thankful for their guidance on this. This doesn't happen if I didn't bug the shit out of Mike in secret, and then also rope in Zach and Seaman and convince Seaman and Peter to do all this. So it's been a lot of fun, honestly. Like there was a period in this time where I was burning out, and then I managed to get this done, and I was like, wow, I'm addicted to work again. Well, more, I guess. So the goals of this chapter of my dissertation are to adapt the gimme algorithm to work in continuous time, kind of leveraging the best parts of gimme, making changes where we have to, and then also evaluating its performance across various conditions and against kind of what we might call realistic alternatives. There's other realistic alternatives. Don't bring them up, please. So the alternatives that we'll be using are just n=1 models, group level modeling, so just assuming everyone's homogeneous. So if you think back to that idio-thetic spectrum, we're really just pulling from the extreme ends and using those as our straw men to punch out of, as well as one condition where I'll be comparing to the discrete time gimme algorithm. So here's the actual algorithm. I did edit it a bit, but there's still some parts missing that I'd like to kind of like walk us through. So continuous time gimmies fitted in OpenMX. Did that just like ring? So continuous time gimmies fitted in OpenMX. That was fun to learn. And it's set up as a state space model using those equations there, where we have the change in X predicted by the drift matrix, which really, for the most part, if you're just interpreting the diagonal elements, is how quickly it's returning back to its home base, given the level of X. And then we have a p-variate residual vector Q that has a covariance matrix of big Q that is p by p in dimension and is our process noise. And we have our measurement equation, which has our factor loadings matrix that's p by p. In this case, despite I can do a multiple indicator thing, but right now we're just doing single indicator, so it is a identity factor loadings matrix, and then we have the error variance or the measurement errors that have covariance matrix R. So that's going to come into play later. So let's just go over the kind of broad strokes how the algorithm works. I don't want to like spend too much time on this. There's things that we can change. There's caveats. There's things that are kind of not fully worked out. So what we do is we start with our n time series for all of our participants. Then we have to define some sort of null model. In this case, I basically just set the drift matrix and the process noise covariance to be free on their diagonal elements, and then we just start from there. We estimate this null model for every single person. We assess their modification indices. Thank you, Mike. And we basically look at the rank order of the modification indices. We take the modification index that's the highest for most people. We do a significance test. If it is, we add it to that. We add it to every single person, and then we fit the model again. We redo it, and then we check the modification indices. We just do that ad nauseum until the best modification index is no longer significant for whatever proportion of individuals that we set. And it'll keep doing that inexorably until one of these three asterisk on the three, it could be four, but three stopping criteria are met. Right now, I'm only estimating dynamics in the drift, so we're not doing like shocks and the process noises. I actually do have the argument to add that, but right now I'm just not testing it. So right now it's just the drift matrix. So once the drift matrix is full, it'll say you've had enough and it'll stop. The second criterion is if the largest modification index is no longer statistically significant, it'll just kill the process. However, if this check.bic is enabled, what it'll do is it'll keep going until the largest modification index isn't statistically significant. Then it'll take the highest modification index anyway, and then just fit that to each person 3 times. And then the whole model search procedure, I'm tracking the sample size adjusted BIC. And once we've fit basically all of the previous models plus 3 just to be safe, we look for the elbow in the scree plot of the BIC, and we select the model state that had the best BIC. The determination of best, I'm using like a C-hull procedure. It's just like the difference in the slope from the previous to the current to the next two. So theoretically, yes.
Why wouldn't you just use a minimum BIC?
Because at least in my experience, the BIC just keeps going down.
Really?
Yeah, until like
It's supposed to get worse
it
eventually.
So what I've noticed is it'll keep going down, and then it'll have this spike up, and then it'll start going down again. If I let it keep going.
It starts to oscillate or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
Versus kind of just like there's the initial part where it is smooth and going down.
Yeah.
And then I think the problem is that with fitting it across all the people, because I'm looking at the BICs across all the people.
Yeah.
And for some people, when I'm doing like the heterogeneous condition, you'll fit a parameter that might be the wrong one to everyone, and then you'll spike or decrease for some people, and then it messes everything up. Yes.
So why BIC?
We chose the BIC because, well, this all started because of really in-depth conversation about how original Gimme has its stopping criterion. So original gimme, I think I can jump forward. Original gimme has you fit criterion to stop. And so I think it's 2 of 3. Is it 2 of 3 for the stopping criterion? It's CFI, NNFI, and RMSEA as the stopping criterion, but then we don't have that in continuous time. So then we were looking for something that could fill some sort of quality metric instead of just, well, we ran out of parameters to add. And I think Mike, you suggested the BIC, or the sample size suggested BIC. And so
I'm just going to say in regularization, people often use EBIC, which has a stronger parameter penalty. Like a much stronger parameter penalty, right? It's meant to help optimize sort of minimal models. And something like that might be an easier, or might lead to more parsimonious models, let's say. Because it's just an additional very strong penalty to try and minimize parameterization.
Okay.
It has a term, with a weight that you can pick as a hyperparameter that adds extra penalty per parameter.
Is that the Chen paper?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I will look that up. I don't have to look it up because I read it for comms, but I will look it up again. So we'll just keep adding parameters until we meet one of those criterion at the group level, and then we'll hand it off to the individual search, where the individual search will basically just repeat this loop again. In some cases, it does just come to a complete stop, and that's totally fine. In the case of the homogeneous conditions that I've been running, in the heterogeneous conditions, it does seem to keep going. So it's not like the largest modification that's not being significant at the level of the group doesn't actually have that much weight once we pass it to the individual. And at the individual level, the place that they're starting at is their null model is whatever we derived at the group search. So it's really similar to Gimme in the sense that whatever we find as a group level model, those parameters become untouchable. And now you can only add parameters from then on. So differences from original Gimme, we are fitting it in continuous time. One additional thing is we have an option to scale the chi-square test. So I didn't note in the algorithm what the chi-square test comparison is to, like it's 1 degree of freedom, but I didn't specify the alpha. So by default, you can have the option to compare it to any alpha level you pick. That should say alpha of 0.5. That should say alpha of 0.05. That explains why my type 1 error is so high. It is 0.5. I haven't fucked up 4 months of running. But what we've added is basically a scaled p-value, essentially, that starts really liberal and then becomes more conservative with each test. It's like a reverse form of the Benjamini-Hochberg penalty. So we start at a 0.05 and then it slowly gets more difficult. The problem with at least with the ones that I was looking at, you have to kind of know the number of tests you've conducted to go back. What I've been doing so far, I'm happy to talk about this if someone has a better idea, because I don't want to just say I winged it. The way that I do it is because I know that the maximum number of tests right now that I could do is the full drift matrix. I just do p times p minus p, because right now the null has the diagonal element set. So I'm setting my penalty to go from 1 to, I guess in the case of a 5-variant model, to 1 to 20. And so the tests just get progressively harder. When we pass it off from the group level to the individual, the penalty is still there. So it still stays difficult. I haven't found that you'll see when I talk about type 1, type 2 error rates, it hasn't had a huge impact on those, even though the individual search starts at a harder place. So we'll get there. We also, like I said, thank you, Tim. We don't have necessarily a fit criterion for stopping, and the BIC check technically doesn't stop the model search anyway, right? So the modification index not being significant at the group level is what stops it, and then we just force 3 extra and we check the BIC curve. And then this last point, because it's done in OpenMX, we can readily include measurement error, and that's why it says because of Youngman. I ran that over the weekend, so we'll have fresh results because of Youngman. So simulations, we have a lot of simulations to talk about. I don't know how I am on time, but I'm just gonna enjoy the moment. So again, the goal was to test the performance of continuous time gimme, various configurations. I have a ton of configurations to keep going, and if people have ideas of things they'd be interested in seeing sooner, let me know, because I am kind of randomly going through my conditions. So right now I've tested things like varying the number of time points per person. Yes.
I saw a tweet that was like, it had to be like 1 million likes. That was like, they want to see multi.
Yeah, actually, so I do have that slide on like gimme. So when I get there, I'll bring up the multivar thing. I'm not adding an entire model. So yeah, so I've tested 50 and 100 time points. This is per person. All of my conditions, I have 20 people, and I've only tested 5 variable OU models essentially. I'm going up to 10 eventually, but it scares me so much that I haven't done it yet. My effect sizes range from small to oh my god, it's going to explode. If you want to know the actual values, the cross-process weights are either positive, negative, 0.3 in the small case and 0.9 in the large case. And then I'm always checking stationarity, and if the stationarity assumption is not met, I just reassign weights and keep going. Surprisingly, it remains stable like quite a bit. I've had to like be a little more strict on the eigenvalues, because if it's close to 0, so it's still negative, but close to 0, it will still not make OpenMX happy sometimes. I have it set to try hard always, so don't ask me. But sometimes it just won't work. Within sample heterogeneity, on the next slide I'll talk about it, but it really is like an on-off switch in my conditions. Unequally spaced data, I got this from Mike. We're basically doing a cumulative sum, doing a random normal at a specific interval of time, such that it's just kind of unequally spaced when we're measuring it. And then when I am doing it, when we have the measurement error condition, I'll talk about it, but measurement error was added. The kappa is an average across all of the participants for a given run. I ran it like several dozen times for each person, and then I was like, okay, this measurement error value is approximately good enough. So when I have measurement error, the kappa, the reliability is 0.8. Otherwise, I just set the measurement error to be like 1e negative 5. So it's practically non-existent, or kappa is practically 1. And then the models that we're comparing, continuous time gimme, group level, I had to put the chain, I'm sorry, Mike. And then discrete time gimme in one case. Simulation design, I kind of touched on this already. We generate our state space model. We have our drift matrix. The diagonal elements are fixed at negative 0.5. 15% are always randomly sampled from the off-diagonal elements. Those are fixed for everyone. And then when I turn on the heterogeneity condition of the remaining paths, 10% of those will be assigned to people. So in the 5 variable condition, people always have 2 unique paths. And then there's 3 that are at the group level. So there's 3 group level paths, 2 person specific paths that are randomly placed. And those paths can be positive, negative, whatever the weight that I'm assigning is. And then I simulate the data at a delta t of 0.1, and then I subsample depending. But really, I've just been using a delta t of 1 this whole time. Like every simulation, I haven't messed with the delta t's yet. The first question that I had, no one has asked me this, but I had the question, was we have different options for continuous time gimme, right? We have just stop at the modification index and have an alpha level of 0.05. Scale the alpha level and just make it more difficult over time, and then use the BIC as a check, and select the best model based off of the BIC. So these are going to be the type 1 and type 2 error rates for the different models. I realize that I've done a horrible job labeling this, but just trust me, it makes sense. we basically have the low effect size, small t, homogeneous, low effect size, bigger t, homogeneous, and then low effect size, larger t, heterogeneous. So it's always ho ho he. And then you can just read that all the way down. But basically, TLDR, the alpha level seems to be the best one kind of across the board until you get like here. In these cases, in the heterogeneous cases, it does tend to pick up a little more type 2 errors. But I was willing to deal with that for just the comparisons. If anyone's curious, I've run actually all of these models on every condition I'm going to show you. But just for this, I wanted to just cut it down because there's a lot of stuff. So every condition, when I'm saying continuous time gimme, I'm talking about the alpha, the scaled alpha one, just because these results seem to tell me I can use that. Yes.
I want to make sure I understand what you're trying to show us in this graph. You're showing us different methods of the stopping criterion.
Yes.
And seeing which one gives you best type 1, best type 2 error rates.
Yeah, across the condition.
And it's sort of similar, except for like the only thing that we're seeing it really vary a whole lot by is what condition you have. Whether it's heterogeneous or the sample size, or I forget what EF was. Effect size. Yeah. So they work all the same.
Yeah.
It's pretty close.
So the first comparison is against discrete time gimme. I really had to like pick and choose. So I'm not wedded to any of these visualizations. In fact, I don't think I've saved any of this code. For people that attend the dinner meetings, I now have untitled 170 like 9 through 170 like or 180 something. So I have a bunch of untitled R scripts that just have these figures. So I'm not wedded to this. What I have is basically the type 1, type 2 error rates. Actually, no, I don't have that. Ignore that. I have the mean absolute bias and the RMSEs. So comparing gimme, discrete time, and continuous time is difficult. So in my individual meeting with Seaman, Peter, and Zach was there as well. What we decided was to just compare everything as a VAR model. So I took the continuous time, the estimated continuous time matrix, I transformed it to the VAR1. I back transformed the structural VAR to a VAR1. These comparisons are only on the lag1 phi matrix. We're ignoring covariances. And the last asterisk to this whole thing is also that in this one condition, the process noises were fixed for the OU models because I'm stupid. So just know that all of these differences are a little more optimal than they would be once I free up those residuals to be estimated. But generally what we see, and I have run this with the measurement error condition I've compared with gimme, the difference does remain, though the difference shrinks, is that the mean absolute bias is in favor of continuous time gimme across the effect size conditions for the diagonal elements, as well as the off-diagonal elements, as well as the RMSE being in favor of continuous time gimme. But that difference shrinks particularly in this case for the diagonal elements once I freed up the residual variances to be estimated. But type 2 error rates were in favor of continuous time gimme, but type 1 error was in favor of discrete time gimme. In fact, it does incredibly well in type 1 errors, with discrete time gimme in the low effect size condition having just 4% and 2% in the high effect size condition. And its type 2 error, when we get to other comparisons, you'll see is actually not that bad, particularly once I'm comparing it to like the other continuous time models. Like it's actually doing pretty well, all things considered. But the continuous time gimme is edging it out in the type 2 error rates. So from here on out, I am comparing just continuous time gimme, n equals 1 in continuous time, group fitting in continuous time. We're not talking about discrete time anymore. It's just more convenient for me to compare the drift matrices. So we're just doing that. So big surprise to literally 0 people, the group level models do really well when everyone is an exact clone. Who would have thought? And more surprising to me, just as a sanity check, is that continuous time gimme outperform the n equals 1 models, right? So at the end of the day, gimme is fitting n equals 1 models. The thing that it constrains is a parameter to be estimated across the group. So in theory, we shouldn't, and typically when I'm looking at the biases and the mean absolute biases for a specific parameter, they're going to be identical between the n equals 1 and continuous time gimme. But there's something to be said with the fact that by leveraging the information, even if the effects are relatively weak, we are capturing more effects and we have less bias or mean absolute bias by leveraging those effects in the homogeneous condition and the heterogeneous conditions by just having other people there that we can use the information off of, even if they're heterogeneous in some way, to some degree. Interesting to me was that the type 1 errors were actually the best for continuous time gimme. So again, this is the one with alpha scaling. So the type 1 error rate was the lowest for continuous time gimme and the highest for fitting n=1 models. I want to note this is across 20,000 individuals, like across all the replications. So this is a pretty stable result. In fact, I think like most of my biases are just like at 0. And then they're like almost perfectly normally distributed about 0. The thing that changes is the RMSEs. Type 2 error rate for the group-based model is 0, which is really cool. And then it goes all the way up to 33% or 34% for the n=1 models. So again, when everyone's a clone, the group level model does well. That makes sense. We expect it to. In fact, that was like my first sanity check, knowing that I fit the multi-group model correctly. Also, thank you to Tim for suggesting it and Mike for confirming it for how to do that. But yeah, we also see kind of characteristically a bias on the diagonal elements, right? So when we have heterogeneity, this is just showing, like, again, I try to do different plots so that I can get an idea of what works and what doesn't. So I'm sorry if it doesn't make sense. So in this case, we have, once again, the type 1, type 2 error rates. For whatever reason, I decided to flip it. Good luck. And basically, the multi-group model in the presence of heterogeneity gets worse as the effect size goes up, right? So the type 1 error rate goes up because we're just finding more paths because everyone is the same, or we're assuming everyone's the same. We're connecting everyone together. But every single person has person-specific dynamics. So then when you're fitting the average model to that, you're going to pick up a bunch of effects. And continuous time gimme kind of across the conditions does pretty well in both type 1, type 2 error. You'll see that this, like, the n=1 for its type 2 error rate kind of skyrockets into the ground. And the reason why that's happening is because in any given condition, 10% of people fail to converge. And this gets to the point that I was talking about earlier, is that the way that we're fitting the continuous time n=1 models is I just fit the full drift matrix and I say estimate this. And it has an incredibly difficult time fitting that. And one of the benefits to just doing this gimme procedure is we're starting from a pretty safe, useless model and then building up the model to become something useful. So we're like in an island of stability for a bit longer. So I have far less convergence issues when I'm using the gimme procedure versus just saying, here, estimate all 25 drift coefficients. Good luck. And then I just like leave it to run. In fact, like this made me edit my code to save out the results before it went to the n=1 stage, because I just have no faith that it'll work at the time. There's a try catch too, but just like in addition to that. So that's why the type 1 error or type 2 error rate kind of crashes into the ground. It does do better, admittedly, but I think this is misleading. Now this is going to seem counterintuitive. It's not, I promise. Yes.
Just out of curiosity, these are all models where groups are real, right?
Yes. So there is a common group structure and
one condition.
Oh, where everyone is different.
One of the reasons people use gimme is to test for group structure, right? And so identifying like trying the case where there isn't any may or may not fit in a dissertation, but trying the case where there isn't a group structure would be very helpful, I think, for people understanding whether they can use this for group search or not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is a really good idea. There's some limitations just in terms of like the amount of paths you need to generate and what the overlap can be.
Well, I think this is part of the problem is like if you've only got two measure or two variable, right? Like you can come up with a very nice group structure out of 100 people because everybody's got to have some combination of paths and there's only so many.
This page, this like exact issue, we just like I have like 4 or 5 pages in like a recent paper about how to actually simulate like heterogeneous dynamics because like you run into all these.
Well, but this I think is a really important question for this kind of model is like what is a group here? right? This is like when you have 2 time points and you're like, here is a rising group, and here's a falling group, and here's a stable group.
Because in
And
reality,
you're like, well, that's
yeah, and we're going to have a lot of shared partial structures.
Right.
Right.
right. Which you'd have by chance. And I think I think that's an open question. Anyway, I wanted to, since it's an open question, I wanted to put it in front of you.
Yeah, yeah.
Let you think about it later.
I have my code set up such that I can just change the group level structure because it's a percentage that I set. I could just set that to 0. So I have to run the other simulations, so I guess I'll do those. But if I do ever just run this for shits and giggles, I will let you know. I might just do that this weekend. But yeah, I think because I had a related conversation about like, because even with 10% off diagonal paths being randomly sampled across 20 people, we only have 20 paths available anyway. So then we have a lot of crossover. And so then that's when the threshold does come into play. For me, I haven't seen it actually affect anything yet. And I have it as low as like 55 right now, just because I'm testing it and I don't know. But one of our conditions is to test the threshold and like vary it. So I think that would be a good time to actually test, like, are we not picking up a model when we shouldn't be picking up a model at the group structure? So I will check that. So this is with unequal samples. So this is with kind of just unequal sample size or unequal time sampling using the cumulative sum. Once again, this is type 1, type 2 error rates. And once again, I've changed the entire plot scheme to confuse all of you. And the only takeaway is that continuous time gimme tends to continue doing well. So in this case, I'm not mentioning the effect size. This is because this is a separate run where I'm using a set effect size of 0.5. So it's kind of in the middle of the weak and strong effect size. We have however many people, I think this is still 20 people. But Gimme's type 1 error rate is pretty consistent across the homogeneous and heterogeneous conditions, whereas the group level model notably gets worse as we expect. And then same with the type 2 error rate. It does go up with the heterogeneous conditions. And it makes sense because more people have their own unique paths. And so we're trying to detect those or not. So we can't really borrow as much from other people. But then the group model, you can see kind of skyrockets into space. Measurement error. This is for Hyungun. Modeling measurement error resulted in lower biases in the diagonal elements of my drift matrix as well as my residual variances. I don't have the residual variances plotted because that would change my entire function and I just didn't want to do that yet. With heterogeneity on, continuous time gimme outperformed both the n=1 and group-based models and type 1, type 2 error rates, but it did have only comparable error rates to continuous time gimme without the measurement errors. Thank you so much, Tim. So it only had comparable type 1 and type 2 error rates. And the reason why I'm still okay with that is that I actually didn't run this like asymptotically. I didn't set like a really obscene high T. So I'm estimating with the measurement errors included, I'm estimating the however many drift matrix parameters there are, plus the 5 residual variances, plus now an additional 5 measurement error variances. Whereas the continuous time gimme that ignores that, ignores the measurement error has 5 extra degrees of freedom that it's not using, but the time is fixed per person. And the thing that I want to kind of just reiterate is that continuous time gimme is still fitting n=1 models. So it still has to run into the issue of estimating an n=1 model with 200 time points, but with extra parameters added. So I think the performance, relatively speaking, is pretty good, all things considered, with the fact that it's losing degrees of freedom as well. And at least in terms of the mean absolute bias, we are getting closer with respect to the diagonal elements. And I remember because I was talking with Hyungun about this, was like, you can see that the cross-process effects are pretty similar. And I think you said that that's what you saw also, right? Yeah, so go us. We replicated each other's studies already. So, discussion. I'm so tired. Continuous time gimme offers unique contributions. I'm telling people to buy this product. We're adapting an existing idio-thetic method to work kind of well in continuous time. circumventing some model convergence issues by building models using simpler structures to begin with. We don't run into the issue of saying, hey, fit this whole model. We are leveraging the flexibility of OpenMX. There's a lot of things that I could free up in OpenMX that I'm not doing, but would be like trivial to turn on. So those things, measurement error, multiple indicators, we could have factor models that we were relating through time. It would be really easy to do that. And I could just easily add these as options, so then someone else can do it instead of me, and I can just get authorship credit. And I think the biggest takeaway is, like, I had mentioned this before, but just expanding access to things like continuous time models and making these kinds of methods more accessible to people who are more creative, who can come up with these theories that leverage this stuff, right? We're kind of in a space that's slightly different from multi-level. We're saying that the differences between people are discrete differences, not random variation that's sampled. And so if you think that the differences between people, the idiosyncratic effects, are unique and completely discrete and different from others, then this is a model that could work, where the multi-level model or framework might impose assumptions that you don't fully agree with. And so I think making these methods is really important and has been really fun. That's why I'm here all the fucking time. So other closing things, continuous time DIMI does pretty well in terms of type 1 and type 2 error rates. I've consistently been surprised. I've stopped by several of your offices and I've been like, what the fuck? And I'm still amazed that it works as well as it does. Leveraging information across people, I was really glad to see that, like, even though it's still an n=1 process, things like bias, type 1 error, like recovery rates are actually better, even though we're still fitting the same model. But something about that pooling of information does really help in estimating both the person-specific dynamics and obviously the group level effects. And there's lots to test. There's things that I haven't even touched yet that I still have to run. So I'll be doing that eventually. But so far, everything seems to be working. And I'm still flabbergasted that it's working as well as it is. I cannot lie to you. So yeah, thank you so much. I will not be accepting it. Yes.
I think I heard you say that you were having that a lot of people weren't converging.
Yeah.
Like, what's the situation there, and under what scenario are you having convergence problems?
It's the high effect size condition. Mostly when T is small, but also when T was 100.
Or T is small is 50.
So it's 50 per person with the 5 variable.
That's fitting n=1 models.
Yes. With the full drift matrix just from the get-go.
Does Gimme do that?
Like throw the errors?
Does Gimme, when fitting n=1 models, fit a full var SVAR model? So why are you doing it here?
So it's because the way that the Gimme procedure is doing it is it's still doing like the model building search.
Yeah.
But then the test that we decided to do for the n=1 is kind of a more naive approach of just like if you think about people who are fitting net worth, they're just, here are all the effects, and then they'll just remove the non-significant paths. That's basically what we're doing. Okay. So then if it doesn't converge, then we're just saying, oh, well.
You could, in theory, do the same sort of additive model search where you start with the diagonal drift matrix where everything just predicts itself.
Yeah.
And then add things.
That was like the original code. Like when I called this the auto with the O, that was the person specific version of this. Like I can do it, but I think the thing that we settled on was to fit the full drift and move backwards instead.
It makes sense in the discrete time framework, certainly, that would be like the straw man, because that's likely what someone would do. And then, and the continuous time, like dealing with the convergence, is probably even more a reason why what you're doing makes a lot of sense. Do you have non-convergence? Yeah, doing that. So I think, to me, that actually like makes sense as a good baseline comparison to like say, all right, this is useful to do. One question I have for you, which I've been like thinking about, and we talked about a little bit, is like, all these different models, like the VAR, the SVAR, and I'm less familiar with like the continuous time VAR. make different assumptions about like exogeneity and endogeneity in terms of like what structures the relationships between the variables. And so like, is it like the S bar, right? We assume contemporaneous relationships are completely endogenous, right? With the var, we assume that they're exogenous. And so like, I'm curious where the continuous time model stands in that spectrum, if that makes any sense. Like, right, you can essentially accomplish something similar to the contemporaneous, but is the, in terms of like, yeah, the innovations, like, is there in traditional OU modeling, is the innovation matrix diagonal?
At least I think I've seen in Zita's paper, she has the off-diagonal elements estimated. And I had mentioned that like when I went to edit the algorithm or the text algorithm, I had Q freed up, and that made me go back and check. And it's an argument. I can free up the elements of.
I'm just curious, like a theoretical, less like your algorithm specifically, more like theoretically, what is the implication of that? Like,
what is the shock?
not necessarily what is a shock, but what is the idea that like, you know, for like either having the shocks be orthogonal versus allowing them to like have kind of some collective influence. Yeah, that's the only thing I was curious about, like just because I don't know that. Like I could maybe see an argument that it's less impactful in continuous time to have the shocks be orthogonal, whereas in discrete time that might be more dangerous, like to do.
I have to be frank and say I don't.
Does that make sense? I'm stumped, like.
No, I was thinking about other things.
I thought this was an amazing talk and like amazing.
I wonder about making the results more compelling and more concrete as like a, I'm thinking about sort of how you want to package this and how you want to like sell it as amazing. If like it's very abstract right now, sort of tied up in like type 1 and type 2 error rates and things. And I want to see some fucking models. Like I want to see data that's modeled and modeled wrong in one way, or like worse, or like find
How the
effect,
structures are different.
like find me an effect that's wrong, or like misses some important thing, and find me something that's correct. And you can take any, like it doesn't have to be real data, but like show me a data set where like I learned something new.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, I totally missed this before, but now that I've got this amazing tool, I can see it, and I did the right thing, and I feel good about myself.
Well, we did talk about using an empirical data set now.
I do think that unequally, like to me, that's a real obvious, like this is where there's value added. Like people all have different unequal intervals. Like all the other approaches would really struggle with that. You'd certainly find like a differentiation between the results.
And I wanted to clarify, each person had their own random.
Yeah. But like in real data, like Mike said, where you can say like,
I think that unequal spacing is a little bit like lackluster. I think, and going back to the history of Gimme, those contemporaneous effects bothered me because we knew that they weren't contemporaneous; they were just faster than the sampling rate. So they were contemporaneous, because they were faster than the scan rate of every 2 seconds. So lo and behold, there are brain processes that took longer than 1/1000, 2/1000, 3/1000, like that took longer than that, but your brain works faster. So getting rid of those contemporaneous effects and instead modeling them in continuous time and being able to separate out the real continuous time process that we think is going on there, I think would be, to me, more compelling. But I'm thinking of that fMRI.
I don't think.
Can I be added?
I don't think okay, because I don't think a comparison is really possible. Like, there's no direct comparison of those two things because they are resting on different assumptions of the. Like, I feel like it's just hard to, like, you have different models. So you have one, you run into that like perennial problem of like, you generate data one way and you fit the generating model to it and then say,
Hey, it
wow,
works.
like, and that's the problem with the transformations too and everything. It's like that. I don't know. For me, that's more compelling on a theoretical level and less compelling in like an empirical level, just because it's hard to compare.
Mhm.
But if there's not a big bang for your buck on non-equal spacing, like I always assumed that was like one of the major
Mhm.
advantages. Is it not that you don't really find big differences?
Uh, in a lot of models, it makes the measurement error crazy. So like all that unequal spacing, at least, and it depends, I'm sure it depends on model structure, but in the models that I've seen, they're basically like doing like McCardle's dual change score model. And if you don't account for unequal spacing in those models, then it gets thrown into measurement error and your measurement error gets way inflated. Whereas if you account for unequal spacing, it's the same with linear growth curve models too. If you say it's measured at age 1, 2, and 3, but it's actually measured at age 1.1 and 2.7 and 2.9, so it's off. It inflates your measurement error
I see.
by not accounting for those unequal spacing in observations. Which, okay, you get better measurement, but that doesn't blow my hair back that
Right.
much.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It might attenuate some of the other relationships as well, or screw up some of the other relationships. Because if you've got something that looks like measurement error, then it can screw up the dynamics or something. So it might be like Laplace's daemon could probably construct, or me, I'm a daemon too, could construct a data set where this really ruins your day.
Well, it could, but like with the idea of really trying to find these like thresholds over. So like if people are sampled at different intervals, such that like a discrete time,
Oh, like one person is sampled daily,
Yeah.
another person is sampled weekly.
or something like that, like wouldn't
That'll mess you up.
like, and that's like a really
That'll be really bad.
and because Jimmy's looking for the same coefficient across all people.
Yeah, that'll be really bad.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
I can do that with your suggestion. When I was coding it, I was like, oh, I want each person to have their own fucky time series.
Yeah.
And so then I can, because you had the other idea of doing a mixture, so I can just add like a binomial term and then make it so that some people, even though they have the same data generating model, will have like they'll be sampled once every fucking blue moon. So I can do that.
Think about like event contingent sampling in EMA.
Oh yeah.
Like you would actually, those patterns would emerge very naturally, like where you may have someone who's smoking a cigarette every day, right? You might have someone who only smokes on weekends.
What do they do with event contingent reporting for the time interval?
I'm not even
They
sure.
pad it.
Probably, yeah.
I think they just
Yeah.
They use the power of to fit their balls.
That's true.
We have event contingent sampling, that's what I'm saying.
But then I think on the other end, right, we would run into that issue that Tim was talking about, where like how slow can we go and still get reliable estimates? But I'm not shying away from it. I think it would be interesting to see like where does it start falling apart.
There's a wide range. I forgot the details when I was talking to Tim, but I generated data that was sampled daily or up to annually in 1 day intervals. And up to like, aside from like a couple of conditions that were just like picking the wrong interval for the process, that were like, oh, that one doesn't work, like that 1 day doesn't work, we got a flat parameter estimate, the same continuous time parameter estimate for sampling once a day to once a year.
Who is alive long enough for you to get a long enough time series from once a year?
You can get aging data. Like,
I feel like with this stuff,
it's like collect annually or once every 2 years.
I feel like
There
that
are
would
some good
work
time
for
points that way.
the amount of time I need to fit this. The measurement error one,
Daily versus every 3-4 days.
Yeah.
That show.
I'm talking yearly. I wouldn't need someone to stay alive for 200 years to get kind of acceptable measurement errors.
Start early.
Yeah, like that speaks to like the like meta analytic potential too, right? Like where you have different studies, different.
Yeah, I think because we agreed that unequal samples in time would be a one-off. Like this isn't getting crossed with everything else. So then I think like going buck wild with it is the way to go anyway. Because like there's like that's the thing I didn't like about the measurement error condition. I set T to be 200 because I was like, this is higher than my 100 condition, so it should be okay. And it did do okay, but I would have preferred to set it to like 1000 and just be like, asymptotically, this is what you'll see. So it bums me out because I'm gonna have to fucking run it again. But just like I think setting it to some extreme and seeing how it plays out is more interesting. So I am gonna have to rerun this with T of 1000. Did you guys run into that issue? Because I know that you're fitting like a multi-level DSEM, right? For the measurement error thing. Like
one.
adding the measurement errors, I had extra parameters, and then I think that really affected like just the performance in general for me.
We had some difficulties.
Okay.
There were some wonky convergence issues that there were a number of factors, but yeah, there's some sensitivity when you add more pre-parameters. I think it's a little harder to converge. It's all Bayesian though, so like you throw more iterations at it, and then you, again, oh.
How do you handle non-convergence in like the simulation conditions?
I get an email, I say several expletives, and then I go.
But like you just omit that.
Yeah. So what I've done, like the try catch that I have right now, because I know that it's always the n equals 1 that'll fail. I just have a try catch, and when that fucks up, I just input a null into the RDS, and then I just keep going. And then when I'm aggregating the simulation results, it doesn't count as a person, it doesn't count as a replication, it doesn't count at all. I can just, one thing I might do is add a counter. Like if I'm not doing any other thing, I might just add a counter so I know how many people messed up. But I usually get the warning number when I'm compiling, and I think one run I had like 70 of my 500 people not converge. So it is an issue in that small t big effect size case.
Because you're probably likely, like in those cases, giving an overestimate of the n equals 1's performance.
Yeah, that's probably like the type 2 error rate in. Is it this one? Was it this one? Yeah. That's why the type 2 error rate like skyrockets down. Like it does get better, it doesn't get that better.
I see.
Like I wish I had just put zeros instead. I mean like ones. You failed to get this.
Yeah, it's hard like to know what exactly to do, but I think reporting them out is a good start.
Yeah. But the n equals 1 has been the nightmare condition.